In the spring of 1945, victory had not yet been declared, but the maps of the British Empire were already the largest ever drawn under a single flag. A chain of territories covering roughly a quarter of the planet's land surface, broken only by the gaps where rival empires still held. A population of nearly 500 million people, from the sheep stations of New Zealand to the coolie lines of the Assam tea gardens, from the copper mines of northern Rhodesia to the dockyards of Hong Kong. London had just presided over the greatest alliance in modern history, the forging of an industrial and financial war machine that, between 1940 and 1945, outproduced the German Reich in aircraft, in tanks, and in naval tonnage, all while standing alone through the long winter of the Blitz. The pound sterling was still the currency of choice in half the world's banks. The City of London still cleared more international trade than any other financial center on Earth. And on the morning of May 8th, when the war in Europe ended and the crowds in Whitehall waved paper Union Jacks past the cenotaph, the empire emerged from 6 years of total warfare intact, exhausted but unbroken. Or so the official story went. It didn't. Underneath that victory, a slow hemorrhage had been running for years. By the time the bunting came down, the empire's finances were, in the calm phrasing of one Treasury memo, in an untenable position. And in a matter of 36 months, that untenable position would force a series of decisions that historians have spent 80 years arguing over. Decisions that, taken together, did something the Kaiser, Hitler, and every rival empire had failed to do in 3 centuries of contest. They ended Britain's reign not with a single dramatic defeat at sea, not with a revolution in the cities, not with a flag raising in New Delhi, but with a quiet, signed, multi-line agreement in Washington, drafted in legal English by officials who were still wearing their wartime suits. Here is the object we will spend this hour with. It is a single page, typed, dated the 28th of February, 1942. The document is called the Anglo-American Mutual Aid Agreement, sometimes called the Master Lend-Lease Agreement. It runs to several pages of legal language, signed in the bleak spring of 1942, when Britain was still very much losing the war in the Pacific, and had just lost Singapore. But buried inside it is one short clause, numbered Article VII, 6 lines long, that begins in the final determination of the benefits to be provided to the United States of America by the government of the United Kingdom. That clause commits the British government, in return for American war material, to the elimination of all forms of discriminatory treatment in international commerce, and to the reduction of tariffs and other trade barriers. It was signed by officials acting for the British Treasury in the earliest desperate winter of the war. At the time, in February 1942, it looked like boilerplate, a thank you note in legal form. The United Kingdom in 1942 owed America its survival. Anything asked in return would be signed. Almost anything. What did that clause become when the war ended? That is the central question of this video. And the answer, traced through a series of dated documents in archives most people have never opened, is the quiet, almost mechanical cause of the British Empire's fall. The numbers in 1945 were not just bad. They were the worst in the country's modern history. Britain's overseas financial war had been run, since September 1939, not on taxes but on debt, and on an accounting trick inherited from the First World War called the sterling balances system. The empire worked like this. India, Egypt, Palestine, the African colonies, Australia, New Zealand, and a series of private holders who bought British munitions during the war, paid for them not in scarce American dollars but in pound sterling, deposited at the Bank of England in London. By mid-1945, those accumulated balances had reached roughly £3,555 million sterling, the equivalent, by the calculation of the Brazilian economic historian Marcus de Paiva, Abreu, and others, of nearly 7 times Britain's entire pre-war annual export earnings. India alone held about £1,250 million of those balances. Egypt held roughly £450 million. These were not loans in any ordinary commercial sense. They were, on paper, assets Britain owed to its own colonial subjects, in the currency Britain itself printed. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ledger, Britain had run out of dollars. The war had stripped the country of its overseas investments. Britain had sold roughly $4 billion worth of foreign assets between 1939 and 1945 just to keep buying American aircraft, American food, American machine tools. By VE Day, the country had, in the memorable wording of one cabinet office paper, about as much gold and dollar resource left as a moderately sized South American republic. The Lend-Lease pipeline, the program that had delivered roughly $31.4 billion of American aid to the Allies over the war, the overwhelming majority of it to the United Kingdom, was terminated by President Truman on the 20th of September, 1945. Abruptly, without transitional grace. Within weeks, British factories that had been assembling Spitfires and Lancaster bombers were starting to lay off workers because American machine tools could no longer be imported. American steel could no longer be imported on the wartime terms. The wartime economy was about to run out of fuel, and the new peacetime economy could not, in the autumn of 1945, pay for its own inputs. Against that backdrop, John Maynard Keynes, then 62 years old, the most famous economist in the English-speaking world, set sail for Washington in early September 1945. He carried in his briefcase a British proposal. He was asking for a settlement of America's Lend-Lease accounts. He was asking, on top of that, for an open-ended American credit of roughly $5 billion to tide Britain through the first stretch of peace. He had the support of the new Labour government, which had just swept Winston Churchill from power in the July general election under Clement Attlee. He had the technical case on the merits, but he did not have the political case. Keynes did not yet know that the American side, under Secretary of the Treasury Fred Vinson and Under Secretary William L. Clayton, had already decided that any loan would come with one non-negotiable condition. Sterling was no longer to be the protected currency of an imperial preference system. Sterling was to be made convertible into dollars at the request of any holder, anywhere in the world, on terms that had been written into the 1942 agreement, in Article VII, 3 years earlier. Keynes understood the implication immediately. The sterling balances of India, Egypt, and the rest of the sterling area represented, in essence, a claim on the Bank of England. If those holders were told they could swap those pounds for real American dollars on a one-to-one basis, they would do so in a single afternoon. The entire Indian sterling account would drain out of London in a week. Britain's gold and dollar reserves would vanish. The pound would collapse, and with the pound, the imperial preference system that had bound the empire into a single protected trading bloc since the Ottawa Conference of 1932 would be finished. Finished not in a treaty of surrender but in a Treasury communiqué. He fought the condition for months. He cabled London. He lost. The agreement signed on the 6th of December, 1945, gave Britain a loan of $3,750 million, repayable over 50 years at 2% interest, plus an additional $650 million line of credit to settle the Lend-Lease accounts. On paper, it looked like an act of state generosity. In practice, it was the largest peacetime financial agreement ever signed between two governments, and it carried, embedded inside its legal text, the convertibility clause. Convertibility would take effect in July 1947. 18 months later, Keynes had been given enough rope, in his view, to hang the empire. He told colleagues on returning to London that he had negotiated, as he put it in a now famous private letter, the worst peace terms Britain had ever signed. "We have sold our birthright," he wrote, "for a little more than $2 billion of additional working capital." Here is a man worth pausing on for a moment, because the man and the moment are inseparable, and because historians of this period return to Keynes again and again. John Maynard Keynes was born in Cambridge in 1883, the son of an undistinguished but respectable middle-class family. His mother had been one of the first women to graduate from the university. From his 20s onward, Keynes had done something few economists in any era have ever managed. He had been right. His 1919 book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, had attacked the Versailles settlement as a vindictive fantasy that would ruin Germany and, in the end, ruin everyone else. He had been right. In the 1930s, almost alone among British economists, he had argued that mass unemployment could be cured by deliberate government spending rather than by waiting out the cycle. He had been right. In the early years of the war, in a now largely forgotten paper drafted inside the Treasury, he had predicted, with eerie precision, the shape of post-war economic collapse if Britain tried to pay for the war on its existing imperial model. He had been right about almost everything, including the parts of his analysis that he himself thought too pessimistic. That made his failure in Washington painful, even for him. The man who understood the mathematics of an empire's finances could not save the empire from the politics of those finances. Keynes was, by the time he returned from Washington in December 1945, a tired man. His heart had begun to trouble him during the long crossing. He had spent the last year of his life publicly defending the loan he privately believed would be fatal. He died on Easter Sunday, 1946, in the home of his friend, the art collector Duncan Grant, 4 months after the agreement's ratification debate in the House of Lords, where Lord Keynes had told the chamber, in words recorded in Hansard on the 18th of December, 1945, that "we have negotiated, not a loan, but a line of credit." Some peers in that chamber treated the difference as a technicality. It was not. The American negotiator in 1945, William L. Clayton, was a different kind of man. A Texas cotton trader turned wartime civil servant, Clayton had been sent to the bleak Moscow embassy and had spent the war years trying to keep Stalin supplied on the Lend-Lease pipeline. He came back to Washington convinced of 2 things. First, that the British imperial preference system, the protected trading zone of the Commonwealth, was a relic of the 19th century that the United States had no commercial interest in preserving. Second, that the post-war economic order, whatever it turned out to be, was going to be written in the United States Congress, not in Whitehall. Clayton had spent years cultivating Cordell Hull's belief in multilateral trade liberalization, and he had the votes in Congress to prove it. He drove the convertibility clause hard. He understood, perhaps better than Keynes did, that if the empire was going to receive American money, it would need to behave like an ordinary country, not a closing club. That was the precondition. Not because Clayton hated Britain, because Clayton believed multilateral trade was the future. The British delegation was small. Keynes and his team sat across from Clayton and a contingent from the Treasury and the State Department. The room was, by all surviving accounts, modest. There was no ceremony. There were no flags. There were only lawyers, accountants, economists, and 1 or 2 American civil servants who understood the gravity of what was being signed. Keynes argued, late into one famous October afternoon, that convertibility would happen in a few weeks, perhaps a month, if the British had to choose between defending their reserves and honoring the agreement. He quoted the cabinet's own reserves figures to his American counterparts. He did this, in part, because he hoped the Americans would back down once they saw the numbers. They did not. A Treasury memo, declassified decades later in the State Department's Foreign Relations of the United States series, records Clayton simply replying that the United States would not extend the line of credit on softer terms. The choice, in the end, was American money with convertibility, or no American money and certain financial collapse in 1946. Keynes did not so much negotiate the agreement as he accepted the terms. The agreement was signed on December 6, 1945. Keynes sailed home. He wrote his famous long telegram to the Chancellor. He tried to argue, almost alone, that the loan should be declined and the country should face the immediate crisis on its own terms. He lost that argument too. By April 1946, he was dead. The agreement lived on. And now we come to the second thread of this story, a thread that, in 1946, looked to British officials like a distant and unrelated piece of imperial housekeeping. It was, in fact, the fuse. In New Delhi, the British Raj was running out of time. The interim Indian government of Jawaharlal Nehru had come to power in the autumn of 1945 with one specific grievance that, it turned out, was not principally ideological. It was accounting. India held, by June of 1947, something over £1,250 million in sterling balances. That money had been earned, in the Indian calculation, by Indian soldiers and Indian taxpayers funding their own war efforts and Britain's war efforts. By the autumn of 1946, the Nehru government began, quietly and in writing, to demand that those balances be settled not in promises of future convertibility, but in real, transferable currencies, pounds that Indian merchants could actually use to buy what India needed. The demand was not, on its surface, a political demand. It was a balance of payments demand. Indian economists inside the Reserve Bank of India were running the numbers and finding that the post-war sterling area, with American convertibility pressure behind it, might not be able to honor those balances on demand. So India asked for early settlement. Britain, in the words of one Cabinet Office minute circulating in late 1946, did not know what to do. The Indian sterling balances were part of the same reserve problem as the convertibility crisis. Britain could not, in 1947, repay India in dollars because Britain did not have dollars. Britain could not repay India in goods because the country was itself rationing bread and meat. So the British government tried a game of delay. The Indian government, in response, pressed harder. The game of delay turned in the spring of 1947 into a political emergency. Muhammad Ali Jinnah and the All India Muslim League saw the sterling balances negotiation as proof that Britain's promises to defend Indian interests at the negotiating table in Washington were empty. If Britain could not, in Cabinet's own view, honor its obligations to India, what else could it not honor? Partition, when it came in August 1947, was driven by religious tension, communal hatred, deep imperial administrative failure, and the trains of revenge that had been building for decades. But it was driven, also, by this accounting fact. Britain could not defend its own currency. Britain could not credibly promise to defend India's. The imperial government's last piece of substance, the ability to make a number add up, was gone. The historian Asiya Hussain, working on this exact negotiation in a 2026 reconstruction of the talks, has argued that the sterling balances question and the partition negotiations were so tightly entangled that they cannot be told separately. She is right. They cannot. This brings us to the moment the thesis of this video turns on. The dramatic object we opened with, the typed agreement of February 1942, finally detonated. On the afternoon of Monday, August 18, 1947, the British Treasury issued a brief statement to the press. Sterling would no longer be convertible into dollars for the holders of those wartime balances, at least not on the terms scheduled under the December 1945 agreement. The clause that Keynes had tried and failed to strip from the American loan had been in force, as scheduled, since July 15 of that same year. In the 6 weeks since, the dollar drain had, according to records declassified in the State Department's Foreign Relations of the United States 1947 volume, gone from less than $100 million a month in the second half of 1946 to over $300 million a month in April and May of 1947. In the 6 working days immediately before the August 18 announcement, the drain had, according to a contemporary report summarized in the New York Times of August 21, swollen to $237 million. Britain had, by that calculation, between 2 and 3 weeks of reserves left. The August 18 announcement amounted to a unilateral breach of a solemn agreement with Washington, signed only 20 months earlier. The loan had not yet been fully drawn down. There was no consultation. There was no warning. There was, in the dry Whitehall phrase, a suspension. The contradiction is this. Britain had borrowed to stay an empire. To get the loan, the British government had signed a clause that would, within 18 months, force the empire's economic system open. Britain had then come to Washington, and in currency, in purchasing power, in measured international confidence, ceased to be the imperial power it had claimed to be. America had asked for a condition that American officials believed would help dismantle the British imperial preference trade system and replace it with an open global market. That was the ambition in Congress. That was the design. Keynes had seen it. He had warned London. The Treasury had warned the Cabinet. The Cabinet had decided to sign anyway because the alternative was default. And so the British Empire, in a series of steps no single minister could have seen end to end, signed itself into a slow, legally enforceable financial collapse. The fall did not happen all at once. It happened across the rest of the century, in increments the working historian can date. In the immediate aftermath, Britain rationed bread for the first time since the wartime U-boat blockade. The age of cheap imperial food was over. American grain began to arrive under the Marshall Plan, beginning in April 1948, and with it, the political weight that accompanied every dollar. Every dollar of Marshall aid was, in the practical politics of Westminster, matched by an act of policy liberalization. Each such act opened another tariff line that the empire had previously protected. Canadian wheat, Argentine beef, Danish butter, products that had been kept out by imperial preference, began arriving on British dinner tables in quantities that British agriculture could not match. Britain was being slowly, structurally, woven into a new trading system whose center was in Washington, not London. By September 1949, the pound had been devalued by roughly 30% against the United States dollar, from about $4.03 to $2.80. The devaluation was, in the technical language of the IMF, an orderly adjustment. In the political language of the empire, it was an admission. The pound was now worth what the markets said it was worth, not what the empire said it was worth. By 1951, Egypt, the second largest holder of sterling balances after India, had forced through its own sterling balances agreement with London, demanding goods and releases of gold in lieu of further accumulation of rupees that might, in the end, be worthless. The Shah of Iran nationalized Anglo-Iranian oil in 1951, partly because the British insisted on settlement in sterling at a rate the Iranians did not believe. In 1954, the last British imperial garrison in the Suez Canal zone withdrew under an Anglo-Egyptian agreement, years before the famous 1956 war. And then came Suez, 1956, the cleanest test case the British Empire ever failed. Anthony Eden's government collaborated with France and Israel to seize the canal after Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal company in July 1956. Britain sent troops, France sent troops, Israel invaded the Sinai. Within a matter of weeks, the Bank of England was forced to pour out its dollar reserves to defend the pound at its Bretton Woods parity of $2.80. Anthony Eden, then Prime Minister, told Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, in words that have entered the historical record, that if Middle Eastern oil was denied to Britain for a year or two, our gold reserves will disappear. If our gold reserves disappear, the sterling area disintegrates. That single sentence is the cleanest thing any British minister said about the entire imperial position, and it was said by a man who knew exactly what he was losing. By November 1956, under heavy American pressure, the Eisenhower administration had publicly sold pound sterling on the open market to dissuade speculators from betting further against the pound, and had refused to support the pound at the Bretton Woods parity until Britain agreed to a ceasefire. The economic historians Adam Klug and Gregor Smith, in a 1999 paper in Explorations in Economic History based on freshly declassified Bank of England records, confirmed what insiders had long suspected. The British position on the ground at Suez was never primarily a military position. It was, by November 6 of 1956, an unfinanced military position. Britain was borrowing dollars to fight, and could not repay the borrowing from reserves already drawn down by the convertibility crisis of 9 years earlier, and was told by Washington to withdraw, and withdrew before any military outcome had been decided. Harold Macmillan took over as Prime Minister in January 1957. He toured Africa the following year. He gave his famous Wind of Change speech in Cape Town in February 1960. Most historians date the actual decision to begin the orderly withdrawal from Africa to the moment Macmillan returned to London from that tour. The decision was financial before it was political. It was, in plain language, a decision to stop spending money Britain did not have. The decolonization that followed took 30 years and touched roughly 30 territories. It is sometimes told, in polite speeches, as a story of British magnanimity and a graceful handoff. It is more honestly told as a story of British insolvency. Whitehall had no more credit. The empire's currency, the pound, was being managed week by week, and sometimes day by the Bank of England, with one eye on the gold window and one eye on the United States Congress. By the time the final imperial dependencies prepared their own orders of independence, the Treasury had already given Whitehall the number. The number was the ceiling on what could be borrowed. The number was what had to be defended. Everything else was sentiment. Now we have to be careful here, and I want to be very careful, because the genuine historical position is more complicated than the simple story I have just told, and this is the part of the video where I want to slow down. The popular version of this story, the one in many YouTube videos, in many podcasts, and in some respectable articles with thin evidence, goes like this. America deliberately destroyed the British Empire through financial blackmail, and this is the moment of imperial fall. The 1947 convertibility crisis was a trap. The 1956 Suez Crisis was enforced by Eisenhower to teach Britain a lesson. There is some real evidence for parts of this story. There is, however, also abundant counter-evidence that the more sensational storytellers tend to leave out. The first problem is that the British government repeatedly and loudly warned itself about the convertibility clause. The cabinet was given warning memos in February 1946. The cabinet was warned again in May 1947, only weeks before the sterling balances drain broke out into the open. The cabinet knew. It signed the December 1945 agreement anyway, because there was no realistic alternative source of credit available. Britain could not realistically have turned to private Wall Street banks for a peacetime loan of the scale required. Britain could not, of course, have turned to Moscow. Britain could not have refused Lend-Lease in 1942 and survived 1943. The constraint on this point was not American malice. It was the simple arithmetic of being the most indebted industrial power on Earth at the end of a 6-year war. The second problem is that the British Empire was already in long economic decline before any American loan was signed. The British share of world manufacturing output had fallen from roughly 15% in 1910 to somewhere between 9 and 10% by 1938. The empire's relative industrial position had been closing on Britain since the late 19th century, as German, American, and Japanese industry overtook the British lead in successive sectors. By 1945, Britain would have faced a painful adjustment under any conceivable set of policies, with or without Article VII. The American convertibility clause was the trigger. The decline was already the gun. Niall Ferguson, in his 2003 book, Empire, The Rise and Demise of the British World Order, makes essentially this argument at much greater length, and he is broadly correct on the structural point. The third problem is that the largest holders of sterling balances, India and Egypt, were not pawns of American power, willing to do whatever Washington told them. They were pursuing their own national interests with considerable sophistication. India could have, and arguably should have, accepted a longer settlement in exchange for favorable trade terms and continued access to British machinery. It did not. Egypt did not. Their negotiating positions were shaped by domestic political constituencies, by the memory of imperial extraction, and by the calculations of nationalist economists, as much as by any pressure from the United States Treasury. The most honest reading of the period, then, is not the conspiratorial one. America did not destroy the British Empire. America bought the British Empire's cooperation in building an open post-war trading system at the price of imperial preference. That system, the Bretton Woods system, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the post-war economic order under which most of the world's economies grew fastest across the second half of the 20th century, was probably beneficial to more people than it harmed. It was also, not incidentally, the system under which Britain stopped being a great power. Both things are true. Both things must be true if we are going to understand what actually happened. This is the truth that tends to get lost in the louder versions of this story, and it is also the reason the historians get it wrong. They get it wrong because they choose one half of the contradiction and pretend the other half does not exist. Which brings us, finally, to the lesson. Empires do not usually fall to invasions. They fall when the bills stop getting paid. Rome did not fall to a single barbarian army. It fell because its tax base collapsed in the 3rd century, and the currency had to be debased, again and again, to keep imperial wages current. The Ottoman Empire did not collapse because of a single foreign war. It collapsed because the Sublime Porte could not service its debts, and the provinces drifted into autonomy, one after another, until only Anatolia and a fractured capital remained. Spain did not lose its empire to a single naval battle at Trafalgar. Spain lost its empire because silver inflation and the costs of continental wars exhausted a crown that could not foreclose on its own commitments and could not bring its treasure home in usable form. The Habsburgs lost most of Central Europe for the same reason. The Russian Empire did not fall to a German army in 1917. It fell because the printing press had to be turned on to pay the troops, and the currency lost credibility. Foreign credit dried up. The country ran out of money it could pay anyone to do anything with. The British Empire, the largest in modern history, fell in the same way. It fell when the cabinet at No. 10 Downing Street in the spring of 1947 opened the ledger and found the numbers did not add up. It fell when Keynes, the most powerful economic mind in British public life, was given the unenviable task of explaining to a Labour chancellor that the country had sold its sovereign commercial policy for a loan and could not afford to recover either the policy or the money. It fell when India demanded, with a quiet claim on the Bank of England, that Britain honor its promise in dollars, and Britain could not. It fell when Egypt demanded the same, and got it, in writing, in 1951. It fell most publicly in 1956, when Washington told London to leave the Suez Canal, and London counted its gold and could not afford to argue. It fell with the right hand of empire writing checks the left hand could not cash, on a series of dated documents in archives most people will never open. If there is one sentence I would ask you to remember from this hour, it is this: imperial power in the 20th century was never simply a question about fleets and colonies and flags. It was always, downstream, a question about who would lend you money, on what terms, for how long. And once that question is answered by someone else, the rest of the answers follow. The empire does not need to lose a war. It does not need to be invaded. It does not even need to be humiliated in a public diplomatic exchange. It only needs to become unable to settle its debts in a currency its creditors will accept. At that point, the rest is paperwork. If you have watched this far, leave the word August in the comments. That is the month of the Treasury communiqué in which the British government admitted, in 2 short lines of printed text, that the convertibility clause signed in 1945 had to be broken. If you do not remember when, just the month, I will know what it means. And if you want to understand the next chapter in this story, the slow-motion end of the British sterling area after Suez, the long negotiations over the 1967 devaluation under Harold Wilson, and the moment in 1976 when the Labour government under James Callaghan had to fly to Washington, hat in hand, to beg the International Monetary Fund for a loan so that the country could simply keep paying its own civil servants. Watch the next video. The fall of an empire does not end with a flag-raising ceremony in a tropical capital. It ends with a balance sheet. We will continue this story there.